At the World Championship for Weighted Calisthenics, athletes can choose to perform either the pull-up or the chin-up when competing to lift the heaviest amount of added weight. And with both movements being allowed, seeing the results of this competition should tell us something about the best option, at least from a performance standpoint. Well, out of 79 athletes, 48 chose the chin-up grip and 31 opted for the pull-up grip. This means that only 39% of competitors chose pull-ups when the goal is optimal performance, and not necessarily hypertrophy or other factors. Yet among these 39%, the heaviest lifts of the competition were achieved using the pull-up grip. So when looking at which variation produces the best results, the data is confusing, and in a way that makes sense, because when performed correctly, both pull-ups and chin-ups rely on the big back muscles in a very similar way. However, there are still some key differences, and it's important to take these into consideration when choosing the one that suits you best, because even though the data is spread out, it reinforces the idea that athletes probably choose according to their biomechanical strengths, and that you need to know the strengths and weaknesses of both variations when choosing which one to focus on. In this video, we'll dive into pull-ups versus chin-ups to help determine the best option for you. Let's start with the obvious difference. Chin-ups use a supinated grip, whereas pull-ups use a pronated grip, and chin-ups are typically performed with a shoulder width or even narrower hand placement depending on wrist mobility, with the elbows pointing mostly forward. On the other hand, the pronated grip from pull-ups benefits from a wider hand placement, causing the elbows to point more to the side. When first starting out, most people learn the chin-up first, but even if it feels stronger initially, this doesn't mean you automatically should favor chin-ups. The reason chin-ups almost always outperform pull-ups among beginners is not because it's superior, it's because beginners struggle with activating their back muscles. And when pulling without back engagement, you have to rely mostly on your arms. The supinated and narrow grip of the chin-up makes arm-dominant pulling easier and more intuitive. This leads to probably the biggest misconception in this debate, that chin-ups are primarily focused on the biceps. In reality, this only happens when your technique is inefficient and you neglect the larger back muscles. And this issue is especially common in the beginning because building a mind-to-muscle connection with the back muscles, and specifically those surrounding the shoulder blades, takes time and effort. I always recommend practicing and improving your scapular control, for example with scapular pull-ups, before committing to either the pull-up or chin-up. And the tendency for chin-ups to feel easier without back activation also explains why, on the contrary, some view only the pull-up as back dominant, and further, that you should choose chin-ups if you have strong biceps and pull-ups if you have a strong back. And while it's true that supination contracts the bicep more, the primary and strongest arm muscle involved when it comes to elbow flexion is actually the brachialis, which is equally activated in both pull-ups and chin-ups. The truth is that both exercises primarily target the back, then the brachialis, with the bicep playing a supporting role in both, just with different emphasis. So bicep strength shouldn't be the deciding factor when choosing between the two, but that is if performed with proper technique, of course. This technique involves lifting the chest and retracting the shoulder blades to ensure that your lats and other back muscles are doing most of the work while still engaging the arms and biceps. So if this is the case for both pull-ups and chin-ups, then the key differences lie not in their muscle activation, but in their mechanical advantages. For example, since chin-ups typically are performed with a narrower hand placement, the range of motion is longer, but because the elbows are kept closer to the body throughout the movement, it has better leverages, in the same way that holding something heavy is easier when held near the chest. So broadly speaking, the chin-up is a longer but slightly easier movement compared to the shorter and more difficult pull-up. And especially in the top part is the chin-up mechanically at an advantage. Throughout the movement, as the hands move closer to the chest, it becomes easier because there's less rotational force on the elbows. In contrast, during pull-ups, the wider hand placement forces the shoulders into internal rotation, which in turn causes the elbows to flare outwards. This gradually puts the body into a less efficient position to generate force. So in the chin-up, the top part is stronger and it's easier to lock the chin over the bar. And even though it's true that you generally get stronger at what you train, no amount of training can change the mechanical advantage that chin-ups have in the top position. To test this, I conducted an experiment. I held the top position of both a pull-up and a chin-up for as long as possible. And even though I personally only train pull-ups in my working sets, my lockout hold was 30% longer in the chin-up. So if your goal is to get your chin horizontally over the bar, chin-ups is almost almost always the best alternative. But there are different ways to train the top position. If you're training just to clear the bar vertically, as I believe most people do, the decision comes down to your strengths and weaknesses. And since this approach has a shorter top range, we also have to consider the bottom part of the movement. Since the lats attach along the inside of the arm rotation caused by the supinated grip leads to a slightly deeper stretch in the lats when hanging freely. In the pull-up, the arms and shoulders are still extended, stretching the lats, but the insertion point isn't twisted, so it's not quite to the same intensity. This is relevant because less muscle stretch generally is stronger as a starting position. That's why you can pull more added weight in an exercise like the pin pull-up compared to a regular pull-up. It's the same principle, and even though it's much more subtle, it still makes a difference in the initial force generation. So basically, the pull-up is a little stronger in the bottom but weaker in the top compared to the chin-up. And this means that if you are naturally stronger in the bottom range and weaker at the top, chin-ups may suit you better, because the mechanical advantage can help you compensate for that weakness, making the lockout feel easier. And on the other hand, if you're already strong at the top and comparatively weaker in the bottom, pull-ups might be the better choice. I've personally always been relatively strong in the top, so that's why I chose to focus on pull-ups. That's my recommendation for performance. But what if you train for health or muscle mass? Well, since hypertrophy and muscle activation is very similar between the movements, you can to a higher degree choose based on feel. For example, despite individual strengths, the supinated grip and the more neutral shoulder position of the chin-up feels much more comfortable for some people. So in that regard, you can listen to your body. Ultimately, both pull-ups and chin-ups are great exercises that target the same muscle groups but with different mechanical advantages. The best choice depends on your goals, strengths and preferences. And lastly, if it matters to you, pull-ups do look cooler. That was it for the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one.